The day my father told me I wasn't his son anymore, he didn't yell. He didn't throw anything across the room. He just looked at me across the kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts, where my mother used to read the Sunday paper, where my grandfather once sat me down and taught me how to play chess. And he said quietly, like he was commenting on the weather, "You're done here, Elliott. Pack what you can carry." I was 31 years old. I had given 9 years of my life to Haskell and Sons fabrication. 9 years of 60-hour weeks, of skipped vacations, of showing up at the shop before sunrise so I could have the floor reports ready when my father walked in at 7. And the reason he was cutting me loose, because I'd gone to the bank. Not to steal, not to borrow. I had gone to the bank because 3 months earlier I'd noticed something wrong in the quarterly numbers, a supplier invoice that didn't match any delivery records, a pattern of small transfers to an LLC I'd never heard of. I brought it to my father. He told me I was reading the reports wrong. I brought it to my brother-in-law, Craig, who'd been handling our finances for the past 4 years, ever since my sister Vanessa married him and my father decided that made him family enough to trust with the company accounts. Craig told me the same thing. Said I was paranoid, so I went to the bank myself and asked a few questions. That was my crime. Craig found out within 48 hours. And 2 days after that, I was standing in my childhood kitchen with a garbage bag of personal items and the keys to my truck, and my father was telling me I had violated the family's trust. Vanessa stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, arms folded, not saying a word. She didn't look at me when I walked past her. I drove for 2 hours without knowing where I was going. I ended up in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel off the interstate, sitting with the engine running, trying to remember how to breathe. I had $740 in my checking account. I had a truck that I owned outright. I had no apartment because I'd been living in the house on the east side of the property, the company house, it turned out, which Craig had informed me was technically an asset of Haskell and Sons and not mine to stay in. I called my mother. She didn't pick up. I knew she was home. I knew she was sitting 15 feet from her phone and letting it ring. That was when I remembered Grandpa Silas. My grandfather on my mother's side had died 4 years earlier. He'd left me something in his will. I knew that much. But at the time, the estate was going through probate, and there was some complication with the property title that his lawyer, a slow-talking man named Mr. Ferris, who seemed constitutionally opposed to urgency, had assured me would be resolved in due course. Due course apparently meant 4 years. I'd received a letter 8 months ago informing me that the matter was finally settled and that I was the sole heir to a parcel of land in Hatchet County, including a structure described in the legal documents as a single-story wood-frame dwelling, approximately 960 square feet, with outbuildings. I'd never gone to see it. I'd been too busy with the company. I found Mr. Ferris's number in my email and called him from the Cracker Barrel parking lot. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding mildly surprised to hear from me after so long. I asked him where exactly the property was and whether I could get into the house tonight. He gave me the address, told me there was a lockbox on the front door with a 4-digit code, my grandfather's Army unit number, as it turned out, and wished me luck in a tone that suggested he knew more about what I was walking into than he was letting on. It took me another hour and 40 minutes to get there, out past the edge of a small town called Farrell's Creek, down a county road that turned to gravel after 2 miles, through a gap in a tree line, and across a cattle bridge that groaned under my truck's weight in a way that made me hold my breath. The headlights swept across the property and I sat there for a moment with the engine off, looking at what my grandfather had left me. It was bad. I mean, it was standing, which I suppose is the baseline, but it was standing the way an old man stands on a bad hip. Technically upright, clearly struggling. The roof had shed half its shingles on the west side. One of the front porch columns had rotted through at the base and collapsed inward, bringing a section of the porch roof down with it. The windows on the south face were so filmed with years of grime and oxidation that they'd gone nearly opaque. There were animal tracks in the mud near the front door, Raccoon, I thought. Maybe possum. The outbuilding, a small workshop it turned out, had lost its door entirely, and it hung from one hinge at an angle that didn't inspire confidence. I sat in my truck for a long time. Then I got out. The lockbox code worked. Inside, the air was close and stale and smelled like mice and old wood and something faintly chemical that I later identified as the residue of whatever my grandfather had been using to seal his woodwork projects. I found the breaker box in the kitchen and flipped the main. Two of the three overhead lights that came on looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration, but they worked. The water ran brown for 3 minutes and then cleared. The gas was off at the meter, but I found a space heater in the bedroom closet, the old coil kind that glows orange and smells slightly dangerous, and I plugged it in and sat on the floor of my grandfather's bedroom because the mattress had a visible water stain the size of a bathtub, and I wasn't ready to deal with that yet. I slept in my truck that first night. I want to say I had a plan by morning. I didn't. What I had was a list scrawled on the back of a gas station receipt. Roof porch, window water, check pressure, electric, get inspected, heat, and underneath that, with a line drawn between them like I was keeping myself honest. Money I have, $740, things that cost money. Everything. I spent the first week doing what I could for free. Cleared the brush from the south side of the house where water was pooling against the foundation. Pulled the collapsed porch section down the rest of the way rather than leave it half-hanging. Found a roll of heavy plastic sheeting in the workshop and stapled it over the worst of the open roof section to stop the rain from getting in. I ate peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup heated on a camp stove I'd had in my truck since a camping trip 3 years ago that I'd never unpacked from. I used the Wi-Fi at the library in Farrell's Creek to watch YouTube tutorials on roof repair, foundation grading, and how to repoint mortar joints in a chimney. I watched a man in Kentucky spend 40 minutes explaining the correct way to sister a damaged floor joist, and I watched it twice. The thing about physical work when your life has just been upended is that it takes up the part of your brain that would otherwise spend all its time being angry. I was angry. I won't pretend I wasn't. Every time I drove a nail or dragged a piece of rotted lumber across the yard, there was a version of me standing in that kitchen, looking at my father's face and wanting to say things I'd never said out loud. But I couldn't afford the anger, not really. What I could afford, barely, was a bundle of architectural shingles from the salvage yard outside of town, where a barrel-chested man named Weston sold me a mismatched but structurally sound collection for $60 and threw in a box of roofing nails, because he said I looked like I was having a rough stretch and he'd been there himself. I was on the roof for 3 days. My hands blistered and then calloused. I learned what it felt like to be genuinely tired, not the tired behind. The eyes of too many spreadsheets, but the kind that starts in your shoulders and works down through your back and settles into your legs like concrete. It was a different kind of tired. Cleaner, somehow. My mother called once, about 2 weeks in. It was a short conversation. She said she hoped I was okay. I said I was. She said my father was very upset. I didn't say anything to that. She said Craig and Vanessa were working hard to stabilize the company through a difficult period. I still didn't say anything. We said goodbye like two strangers who had run out of small talk, and I sat in the truck afterward with the phone face down on the seat and looked at the house and thought about the word difficult. By the end of the first month, the roof was sound. The porch was gone. I'd torn it off completely, stripped it to the foundation, decided a replacement would have to wait, but the house was dry. I'd gotten the electricity inspected by a man from the county office who charged me $85, told me the panel was outdated but functional, and recommended I not run the space heater and the microwave at the same time. I replaced the mattress with a used one I found on the Buy Nothing group in the county Facebook page. I patched the bathroom subfloor where a slow leak had been rotting the wood for what looked like years. I was, by any objective measure, a man with no income living in a half-restored house in a county he'd never spent significant time in, eating store-brand soup and going to bed at 9 o'clock because he had to be up at 5 to get the light. I was also, for the first time in 9 years, sleeping through the night. It was late November when I finally got to the bedroom at the back of the house. I'd been avoiding it, not consciously, but the way you avoid the room where you stored the boxes after someone dies. Grandpa Silas had used it as his main bedroom for 40 years, and it still felt like his. There was a framed photograph of my grandmother on the windowsill. There was a small wooden box of cufflinks on the dresser. There was the smell, still, beneath the staleness, of the cedar blocks he'd kept in his closet and the particular pipe tobacco he'd given up in his 60s, but that had spent so many decades soaking into the walls it would probably outlast the house. I started with the closet, cleared out his clothes, which I folded and set aside in paper bags for goodwill. It felt wrong to throw them away. Found a shoebox of old photographs that I set on the dresser to look through later. Found a metal ammunition box bolted to the back wall of the closet shelf that I assumed was for a firearm, but turned out, when I unscrewed the bracket, to contain 4 decades of vehicle maintenance records for a 1968 Ford pickup I'd never seen, and which may or may not have existed anymore. Then I turned my attention to the east wall of the bedroom. I noticed it because of the baseboard. The baseboard along the east wall was a slightly different wood than the rest of the room. The rest of the trim was original white oak, old and darkened to the color of honey, but this section was pine, painted over multiple times but visible at the edge where the paint had chipped. It was newer. Not new, maybe 20, 25 years old, but newer than the rest, and the wall itself, when I pressed my palm flat against it, had a faint hollowness to it, a give that didn't match the solid resistance of the surrounding plaster. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the wall. Grandpa Silas had been a meticulous man. An engineer by training, a craftsman by temperament, he did not make mistakes in his construction work. If this section of the wall was different, it was different on purpose. I got a stud finder from the workshop. Then I got a hammer. Then I stopped, put the hammer down, and went and got the pry bar instead, because if there was something behind this wall that my grandfather had put there deliberately, I didn't want to come at it swinging. I worked the pry bar carefully along the edge of the pine baseboard. It came away from the wall in a single piece, which told me something. It hadn't been nailed in the way a real baseboard is nailed, the way you set it and forget it. It had been installed to come off. Behind the baseboard was a seam in the drywall, barely visible under the paint, running floor to ceiling about 4 feet from the corner. I worked the pry bar into the seam. There was resistance, and then there wasn't, and a panel of drywall, framed in pine on its hidden side, like a door without hardware, swung inward on a hinge I hadn't seen. Behind it was a space approximately 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, running the full 8-foot height of the wall. Dry, which surprised me. My grandfather had apparently waterproofed it somehow, or the house's roofline sheltered it, or both. There were 2 shelving units built into it, simple pine boards on bracket supports, and on the shelves, arranged with the same quiet neatness that characterized everything my grandfather did, were 2 things. The first was a cedar chest, small enough to carry with one arm, locked with a standard padlock. The second was a large manila envelope, sealed with packing tape and labeled, in my grandfather's handwriting, the cramped, leftward slanting script I'd recognize anywhere, with a single name, mine, my first name. Just Elliott, in blue ballpoint pen, in the hand of a man who had been dead for 4 years. I sat down on the floor of the bedroom. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light from the window to shift. Long enough for my legs to go partially numb from the cold floor. I just sat with the envelope in my lap and looked at my name on it. Then I opened it. There were 2 sets of documents inside. The first was a stack of what I initially thought were stock certificates. They had that formal, printed look, cream-colored paper with decorative borders. But they weren't stock certificates. They were bearer bonds. 12 of them in denominations I had to read twice before I believed. $50,000 each, $600,000 in bearer bonds, still valid, issued by a private lending institution in the 1990s, and as I would learn from a very patient teller at a Knoxville bank branch 2 days later, perfectly negotiable, and fully mature. The second set of documents was something else entirely. They were records. 43 pages of photocopied bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, property title records, and correspondence between my grandfather and an attorney I didn't recognize named Beaumont. I started reading at the top and didn't stop for 2 hours, sitting cross-legged on the bedroom floor as the temperature dropped and the light went gray. What I read was this: 22 years ago, when my mother was in her late 30s and I was about 9 years old, my grandfather had discovered that his own son-in-law, my father, had been quietly transferring assets from a business my grandfather had co-founded with him. A small but profitable tool and die operation called Haskell Precision, into accounts my father controlled entirely. The transfers were small and regular, the kind that are designed not to be noticed. My grandfather noticed. He hired an accountant outside the family to verify what he was seeing. He had the accountant's report notarized. He had his attorney, Mr. Beaumont, draft a letter, and then, apparently, he made a decision I still don't fully understand. He chose not to confront my father directly. He chose not to go to the courts, or to my mother, or to anyone. He gathered every piece of evidence, put it in an envelope with my name on it, and he sealed it behind a wall in his bedroom. There was a letter in his handwriting at the very back of the stack. It was addressed to me. I'm going to spare you the full text of it. Some things are between a man and his grandfather, but the relevant part, the part that mattered for what came next, was near the end. He wrote that he had chosen not to act while he was alive because he believed that confrontation without the right moment was just noise. He wrote that he hoped I would never need what he'd left me, but he wrote that if the day came when I did need it, I should take it to someone I trusted and I should not be afraid to use it. He signed it with his full name, Silas James Haskell, and under his name, in smaller letters, he'd added, I always knew you were the one who was paying attention. Don't stop. I drove to Knoxville the next morning, not to the bank first, to a lawyer's office. I'd found her online, a woman named Constance Alp who specialized in business fraud and estate law, whose firm had a decent website and 3 Google reviews that all said variations of, she does not mess around. I cold called the office and told the receptionist I had documented evidence of financial fraud by a family member and 43 pages of supporting records. I was given an appointment for that afternoon. Constance Albright was in her mid-50s, small and composed in a way that made the room feel smaller, and she read every page of my grandfather's records in 47 minutes without saying a word. Then she set the stack down on her desk and looked at me. How long did you work for Haskell and Sons Fabrication? She asked. 9 years, I said. Were you compensated in equity at any point? No. My father always said that would come when the time was right. She nodded slowly. The time is right now, she said, but not in the way your father anticipated. What followed was 6 weeks of legal preparation that I won't bore you with in detail. Depositions, records requests, a forensic accountant that Constance hired to trace the full history of the transfers, which turned out to be larger and longer running than even my grandfather's records had captured. Craig, my brother-in-law, had continued the pattern after he joined the company. He had been methodical about it, and for 4 years he'd also been methodical about keeping my father from looking too closely, which is a thing that is not very difficult to do when the person you're managing happens to want to believe things are fine. My father found out what was coming the same way he'd found out about my bank visit 4 months earlier, through Craig, who had apparently retained his own attorney the moment Constance's firm sent the first records request. He called me. It was the first time he'd called me since the morning he told me to leave. Elliott, he said. I think we need to talk. I agree, I said. I'll have my attorney reach out to yours. There was a long pause, long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. Your grandfather's been gone 4 years, he finally said. Whatever he thought he knew. He knew exactly what he knew, I said. He wrote it all down. He was always very thorough. I hung up. The meeting happened in February, on a Tuesday, in a conference room at Constance's firm. My father came with his attorney, Craig came with his Vanessa didn't come at all, which I didn't learn until I walked in and saw the empty chair where I'd expected her to be. The room was too warm and smelled like burnt coffee, and no one offered to shake hands. Constance did most of the talking on my side. She was precise and unhurried, and she had a way of presenting information that left no room for the usual maneuvers. No, that's not how I remember it. No, you're taking this out of context. She had the forensic accountant's report. She had the notarized records from 1999. She had transaction records going back 21 years. My father looked older than I'd remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. He sat across the table with his hands flat on the surface, and for most of the meeting he kept his eyes on the documents rather than on me, which I understood. Looking at the documents was easier. It took 3 hours and 2 breaks and one tense hallway conversation between the attorneys, during which I stood at the window looking at the parking lot and thought about my grandfather teaching me to play chess at the kitchen table. He had always made me play through the whole game. Even when the outcome was obvious, even when I was 8 years old and wanted to flip the board and be done with it, he would say, quietly but firmly, "You don't leave a game until it's finished." The settlement was not small. I won't give you the exact number because I've been advised not to, but I will tell you that it included a restitution of assets, a buyout of what Constance established was my rightful share of the company's growth during the years I'd worked there without equity, and a separate agreement regarding the transfers Craig had made. Craig's employment was terminated as part of the agreement. My father retained control of Haskell and Sons fabrication, which by that point I didn't want it, and didn't want the weight of what it had become. What I wanted was the property in Hatchet County. I was back at the house by late February, the bare trees still showing, the pasture behind the property silvered with frost in the mornings. I had money now, real money, enough that I could hire people and buy materials and do this right instead of doing it desperate. But I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I didn't want to stop working with my hands entirely. I hired a crew for the structural stuff, a proper porch rebuild, new windows throughout, the plumbing brought up to code by a licensed plumber named Walt, who was not the same Walt from the band names list. This was a different Walt, entirely a compact man from the next county over who chewed toothpicks and did immaculate work. But I stayed on site every day. I framed in the new back addition myself. I ran the flooring in the main rooms. I built the kitchen cabinets from scratch, white oak, the same wood as the original trim, and I spent 2 weekends on them because my grandfather would have spent 2 weekends on them, and that felt like the right approach. By April, when the dogwoods came out along the fence line, and the old pecan tree in the back put out its first leaves, and the pasture turned from silver to green, the house was finished. I want to try to describe it for you, because I know that's the part you want to see. The part that's hardest to communicate in a story told with words. So, white clapboard, repainted, the porch rebuilt with square columns, and a proper beadboard ceiling painted the color of the sky between clouds. New windows, double-paned, which transformed the light inside from the flat institutional glow I'd grown up in at the company house to something that moved and changed through the day. The floors refinished to a color that let the grain show through. The kitchen, my kitchen, with the white oak cabinets and a farmhouse sink I'd found at an architectural salvage place, and a window above it that looks out over the back pasture, which on a clear morning is one of the more peaceful things I have ever looked at. My grandfather's bedroom, the one at the back of the house, I left mostly as it was. New mattress, fresh paint, the trim refinished. But the east wall, I patched it, of course, carefully, and I repainted it. And on the wall, where the panel used to be, I hung the framed photograph of my grandmother that had been sitting on the windowsill since I arrived. She's young in it, maybe 25, standing outside some building I don't recognize, squinting into summer sun, laughing at something just out of frame. She looks like someone who's having an excellent day. I like looking at it. The cedar chest from the hidden space, I opened it with a locksmith. Inside was my grandfather's army discharge paperwork, his marriage certificate, the deed to a piece of property in Georgia he'd sold in 1978, and a single poker chip from a casino in Las Vegas that no longer exists. A life, compressed and reordered into a cedar box. I keep the box on my dresser now, next to a small coffee maker and a library book about watershed restoration that I've been meaning to read for 3 weeks. My mother came to see the house in May. She came alone, drove herself up from the city, stood in the driveway for a moment before she knocked on the door like she wasn't sure she had the right to. I made coffee. We sat on the porch and didn't talk about any of it for a long time. Not my father, not Craig, not Vanessa, not the conference room in Knoxville. We talked about her sister's new grandchild, and about whether the pecan tree had a disease affecting the new growth on one branch, and about a news story we'd both seen about a bridge reconstruction in Nashville. After a while, she put her mug down and looked at the front of the house and she said, "Your grandfather would have loved this." "I know," I said. "He always thought you were like him," she said. I didn't answer that right away. I watched a pair of swallows working the fence line, doing the same short loop over and over, precise and unhurried. "He told me," I finally said. "In a letter." She looked at me and I think she understood from that more than I actually said. Her eyes got quiet. She picked up her mug again. "He was always thorough," she said. Yes, he was. We sat on the porch until the light went gold and long across the pasture, and my mother finally said she should get on the road before dark, and I walked her to her car, and she hugged me in a way she hadn't hugged me in a long time. Not the brief, functional hug of family occasions, but the kind where the person holds on for a moment longer than necessary. I let her. I stood in the driveway and watched her car reach the end of the lane and turn onto the county road and disappear behind the tree line. Then I went back to the porch and sat back down in the chair that had been my grandfather's, the one with the cracked armrest that I'd repaired with a piece of matching oak and a clamp and an afternoon. And I looked at the pasture in the last of the evening light, and I thought about the man who'd bought this land and built this house and hidden the truth inside its walls and trusted that I would find it when I needed it. He had been right about that. He was right about most things. I took out my phone and set it face down on the armrest, and I sat there until the stars came out over Hatchet County, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else.